2 weights.
Copy. Titan, drop 2 weights.
Let's listen to that part again.
500 meters, 30. What was that bang?
What was that bang? Wendy Rush asks with a small, anxious, perhaps just a curious smile. That, Wendy, was the sound of dreams imploding. That, Wendy, was the sound of your husband and all 4 others on board dying instantaneously, and your life and many others never ever being the same again.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. As many of you know, I've covered this particular incident. There are almost 100 videos on this particular incident, and now there's a documentary coming out on Netflix, also on the Discovery Channel. The US Coast Guard released a clip on Thursday, May 22nd, showing Wendy Rush monitoring data and text communications. This is footage we've never seen before. She's sitting at a computer alongside Gary Foss, and he was part of the communications and tracking team for the Titan Submersible. They were on board a support vessel, it was called the Polar Prince, which was near the Titanic wreckage site in the North Atlantic Ocean. This was, if you remember, June 18th, 2023. We are almost 2 years after this incident. Now, a sound heard at the 24-second mark, later correlated with the loss of communications and tracking, is believed to be the sound of the Titan's implosion reaching the surface of the ocean. That's according to the Coast Guard. This is an official US Coast Guard statement. Now, if you understand sound moves a lot slower than the speed of light, and so this would have been a delayed sound. By the time they heard the sound, actually the Titan would have been, the implosion would have happened several seconds before that. And so in the clip, Wendy asks, what was that bang? The noise was heard when the sub reached a depth of approximately 3,300 meters. They were still about half a kilometer, another 500 meters to go to the actual depth of the Titanic, which is at 3,800 meters or 12,500 feet. That's around 2.3 miles below the surface. The time it takes for sound to travel through 3,300 meters in water is 2.2 seconds. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, if you are interested in the Titan Submersible, as I say, there's a playlist with around 100 videos. So I'll put a link to that playlist in the description. If you find, also bear in mind there's a documentary coming out on the Discovery Channel in 2 days on May 28th, and then also on Netflix on the 11th of June, titled Implosion, the Titanic Sub Disaster. I'll be doing an analysis of that documentary, so if you're interested, please do hit the thanks button. You can also subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's get started.
500 meters, 30. What was that bang? Drop 2 weights.
Now you'll notice when Wendy Rush, that's Stockton Rush's wife, when Wendy says, what was that bang? She doesn't get any response from the man beside her, and one can only wonder what he thought. Why doesn't he say anything? What is he thinking? And it is quite a dull thud when you listen to it. Let's listen to it again.
500 meters, 30. Yeah, we should be about 500 meters, 30. Yeah, we should be about 500 meters, 30.
Again, remember, this is the sound moving 2.2 for 2.2 seconds through over 3 kilometers of water, and it's still audible, right? It sounds kind of like a plastic drum being hit softly. So soft thud, but of course, if you were right there, it would be a deafening explosion, or more accurately, implosion. Now, it is very interesting that ahead of the documentary Implosion, the Titanic sub-disaster, about to be released on Discovery on May 28th and Netflix on June 11th, the Coast Guard appears to have preempted all of this by providing never-before-seen footage of the CEO's wife hearing the explosion and apparently coolly dismissing it on camera, albeit while verbalizing what was that bang. Why do you think the Coast Guard has released this to the public at this point? Is it to control the narrative? And what is also interesting is that they didn't release this footage during their hearings, which were quite extensive. They held that back. Was that to protect Wendy Rush? Now, according to People, quote, before the implosion, which killed all 5 people on board, Wendy received a message from the sub saying it had dropped 2 weights, according to the new video. As previously reported by People, the Titan messaged about weights at 10:47 a.m. local time that day. And so it was a couple of seconds after that, literally 2 seconds after that, that contact with the submersible was lost, right after that message, and lost permanently. There was not another message after that. Now, it's interesting that Titan wanted to drop those weights, which means that for whatever reason, either they were hearing things or they felt that they were at a sufficient depth that they wanted to slow down their descent. But it is interesting that pretty much at the moment, at the fatal moment, they basically wanted to slow their descent, and of course it was too late. Possibly were they descending too quickly. In hindsight, doesn't this mean that Wendy Rush likely knew the sub was lost the moment it was lost? I mean, you might not know it at that very moment, but certainly a minute later, 2 minutes later, you still haven't heard any further communication. 5 minutes later, no more communication. Half an hour later, an hour later, 2 hours later, 5 hours later, 10 hours later, 24 hours later, it can all be traced back to that bang noise, and you never restore communication after that. Well, aren't you going to draw a logical conclusion? That bang noise was something catastrophic. What else could it be? It does seem as if OceanGate pretended not to know the worst, or certainly didn't reveal this very pertinent information to the media or to other authorities until now. We know it now thanks to the Coast Guard. Does anyone remember the crew being told to turn off their phones on deck? Does anyone remember a story about that? Anyway, going back to People, the Coast Guard told the BBC the text about the weights was sent before the vessel failed, and this is why it can be a little bit confusing, is that the sound of the bang is moving at a different speed, right? And so it seems like it's coming at a different time. It's that people are still alive. But it just took longer to reach the support ship than the sound of the implosion. I'm not quite sure why that is. The sound in water is moving at a particular speed, in other words, of the explosion. The sound of the text, I'm not quite sure how that works. Is it going through some kind of global infrastructure? It's kind of hard to say. Anyway, the Marine Board of Investigation continues to probe the tragedy. Probably they heard many bangs during Titan's all-too-brief evolution as an experimental carbon fiber deep-sea taxi to the Titanic. And, they were hearing many bangs, and it was so easy to dismiss this one. Of course, this bang was likely the loudest, and, as we know now, the last. It's rare in true crime to know the exact time when a life is lost, and in this case, all 5 lives were lost. And this is one of those tragic instances. Although Wendy doesn't seem to realize it at the time, this was the moment all was lost. 5 lives vaporized in a very preventable incident. Her own ignorance, some might say naivete, explains perhaps best just how deluded those on board were with the clear and present highly imminent dangers this experimental craft faced. So, even when you hear this bang, they don't seem to show the right amount of distress or fear given what had actually happened. And in any event, this was it. Catastrophe, game over. This explosion would herald not just the end of OceanGate and pull the curtain on all further missions, but it would spell the end of her marriage and her job. Wendy Rush's life would change permanently after this moment, even though there's a smile on her face. Also, P.H. Narchile and the others on board, they were part of the tally of the dead. And worst of all, someone was going to have some explaining to do. Clearly, Wendy Rush herself hasn't felt the need to offer any kind of explanation thus far. But isn't an explanation required from someone? We're 2 years after the fact. Either someone on the OceanGate side or on the Coast Guard side following an exhaustive investigation. Well, aren't we owed an explanation for exactly what happened? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.